If there was one man everybody wanted to be like in Lagos, it was Mr. George. You could hardly mention wealth without someone mentioning his name. He was one of the biggest businessmen in the country. He owned hotels, shopping malls, transport companies, filling stations, and several estates in different parts of Nigeria. But behind all his wealth was a dark secret nobody knew about. Many people called him an inspiration. Others called him a blessing to the nation, because he donated millions of naira to hospitals, schools and orphanages every year. To the whole world, Mr. George was the perfect example of a self-made billionaire. A man who rose from nothing and built an empire through hard work, at least. That was the story everyone believed. But behind the expensive suits, behind the beautiful mansion, behind the luxury cars, and behind the smiling face, the cameras always captured. Mr. George was hiding a secret. Not an ordinary secret. A secret so dangerous that, if it ever became public, everything he had spent almost 30 years building could disappear within a few days. His businesses could collapse. His family could abandon him. The same people praising him today would be the first to condemn him. That was why Mr. George trusted nobody, not even the people closest to him. His wife believed she knew everything about her husband. She didn't. His 2 children believed they understood how their father became rich. They were wrong. Even the lawyers who handled all his businesses had no idea what Mr. George carried in his heart every single day. For more than 25 years, he lived with one fear. Not the fear of losing money. Not the fear of losing his companies, but the fear that one day, someone would uncover the truth, and if that happened, there would be no amount of money powerful enough to silence it. That fear followed him everywhere. It followed him into board meetings. It followed him to church. Sometimes, in the middle of important business meetings, he would suddenly become quiet. His mind would drift far away as though he was remembering something he wished had never happened. Those who worked with him simply thought he was tired. Nobody knew what was really going through his mind. Every year, on the same date, Mr. George cancelled all his appointments. No meetings, no visitors, no interviews. Even his family knew not to disturb him on that particular day. Whenever anyone asked why, he always gave the same answer. I just want to be alone. Nobody questioned him. After all, he was the boss. As the years passed, people continued to admire him. Some prayed to become as rich as he was. Others envied his success. But none of them knew that the man they celebrated every day had spent years running away from one mistake. A mistake that refused to stay buried. Then one Monday morning, something happened that Mr. George had prayed would never happen. His secretary walked quietly into his office carrying a plain brown envelope. "There is no sender's name, sir," she said as she placed it on his desk. Mr. George looked at the envelope for a few seconds. It looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested there was anything important inside. After his secretary left, he picked it up and slowly opened it. There was only one sheet of paper inside. No signature, no address, just one short sentence. As soon as his eyes fell on those words, the smile disappeared from his face. His hands began to shake. For the first time in many years, the billionaire looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He quickly locked his office door, read the letter again, and sank into his chair. The secret he had protected for 25 years had finally come knocking. Mr. George sat quietly in his office for almost 10 minutes without saying a word. The air conditioner was on, but sweat covered his forehead. He picked up the letter again and read it for the 3rd time. The message was short, very short, but every word on that paper reminded him of a past he had spent 25 years trying to forget. He stood up immediately, picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. The call didn't connect. He tried again. This time, the phone was switched off. He dropped the phone on his table and began pacing around his office. For the first time in years, he cancelled every appointment for that day. His secretary knocked gently on the door. "Sir, the board members are already waiting." Mr. George didn't even look at her. "Tell them the meeting is cancelled." She looked surprised. "But sir, investors have traveled from Abuja and Port Harcourt." "I said cancel it." His voice was calm, but there was something unusual about it. The secretary quietly closed the door and left. Outside the office, the staff became confused. Mr. George had never cancelled a board meeting without a serious reason. People began to ask questions. Is he sick? Did something happen? Nobody had an answer. Back inside his office, Mr. George unlocked a small drawer beneath his desk. From inside, he brought out an old photograph. The edges had already faded because of age. He stared at it for a long time. His eyes slowly filled with tears. It had been years since anyone had seen the billionaire cry. He gently ran his fingers across the picture before whispering to himself, "I knew this day would come." A few minutes later, he placed the photograph back inside the drawer and locked it. Then, he pressed the intercom. "Tell my driver to get the car ready." "Yes, sir." Within 15 minutes, the black SUV drove out of the company headquarters. But instead of heading home, Mr. George asked the driver to take a route he had not used in more than 20 years. As they left the busy roads of Lagos behind, the buildings gradually disappeared. The journey became quieter. The smooth roads gave way to rough ones. The driver looked through the mirror. "Sir, are you sure we're going the right way?" Mr. George looked out of the window without answering. Every tree, every old building, every bend in the road brought back memories he had struggled to bury. Almost 3 hours later, they arrived at a small village. Time seemed to have stood still there. Old women sat outside their houses, chatting. Children ran barefoot along the dusty road. Goats wandered freely from one compound to another. The driver parked under a large mango tree. "Sir, should I wait here?" Mr. George nodded. "I won't be long." He stepped out of the vehicle and slowly walked toward a small mud house at the end of the street. The house looked abandoned. The roof was partly damaged. The wooden door was old and cracked. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, staring at it. It was clear he had been there before. He raised his hand and knocked gently. No response. He knocked again. Still nothing, just as he was about to turn back. An elderly woman opened the door a little and looked at him. She studied his face carefully. Then her expression suddenly changed. "You," she whispered. "I never believed you would come back." Mr. George lowered his head. "I had no choice." The old woman looked at him for a long moment before asking the one question he had feared for 25 years. "Have you finally come to tell the truth?" Mr. George couldn't answer. He simply stood there in silence. Because deep down, he knew the secret that had made him one of the richest men in Nigeria was no longer safe. The old woman stepped aside and slowly opened the door. "Come inside." Mr. George entered quietly. The room was small. There was an old wooden chair, a table with faded paint, and a kerosene lamp hanging on the wall. Nothing had changed. It looked exactly the way he had left it 25 years earlier. The old woman sat down and looked at him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I knew this day would come." Mr. George sighed. "I prayed it wouldn't." The old woman shook her head. "You can run away from people, but you can never run away from your past." Mr. George lowered his head. He knew she was right. The old woman reached under the table and brought out a small metal box. It was rusty. The lock had almost fallen apart. She placed it in front of him. "I've kept this for 25 years. I was waiting for the day you would return." Mr. George stared at the box. His hands trembled. Slowly, he opened it. Inside were old documents, a few photographs, and a folded piece of paper. The moment he saw the handwriting, He closed his eyes. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to his closest friend. The same friend who disappeared many years ago. Mr. George unfolded the letter with shaking hands. He couldn't finish reading it. The guilt was too much. The old woman looked at him quietly. "You have carried this burden for a long time, huh?" He nodded. "I thought building schools, hospitals, and helping the poor would give me peace. It didn't. I made all the money in the world, but I still couldn't sleep." The old woman spoke softly, because money cannot silence a guilty conscience. Mr. George wiped his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember what really happened. 25 years earlier, he and his best friend Daniel had started a small transport business together. They had only one old bus. Daniel was honest, hard-working, and full of dreams. Mr. George handled the business. Daniel traveled across different towns to bring customers. Business was slow at first, but after a few years, they finally got the opportunity they had been praying for. A wealthy investor agreed to finance their company. The investment was enough to change their lives forever. But greed entered Mr. George's heart. Instead of sharing the business equally, as they had agreed, he secretly changed some of the documents. On paper, the company now belonged to him alone. Daniel knew nothing about it. A few weeks later, Daniel confronted him. They argued. Harsh words were exchanged. Daniel walked away in anger. That same night, he was involved in a fatal road accident while traveling back to the village. The news broke Mr. George. Not because of the accident alone, but because Daniel died believing his closest friend had betrayed him. From that day, Mr. George became the legal owner of the entire company. As the years passed, that single company grew into a business empire worth billions. Everybody called him a self-made billionaire. Nobody knew that the foundation of his wealth had been built on betrayal. The old woman looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Daniel was my only son. I watched him trust you like a brother. I also watched him die with a broken heart." Mr. George could no longer hold back his tears. "I'm sorry. I know those words can never bring him back." The old woman nodded slowly. "No, they can't. But there is one person who deserves to know the truth." Mr. George looked up. "Who?" The old woman pointed to a framed photograph on the wall. It was a young woman standing beside two little children, Daniel's daughters. "She is alive, and she has spent her whole life believing her father died poor." Mr. George felt his heart sink. He had never seen Daniel's daughter. He didn't even know where she was. The old woman looked him straight in the eyes. "If you truly want peace, don't tell the newspapers. Don't organize a press conference. Go and find her. Tell her the truth yourself." Mr. George remained silent. As he left the house that evening, he realized something. The letter that had arrived in his office wasn't a threat. It wasn't blackmail. It was a final chance. A chance to correct the biggest mistake of his life. But he had no idea. Someone else had already discovered the truth. And that person was waiting for the right moment to destroy everything he had built. Mr. George returned to Lagos a different man. For the first time in 25 years, he stopped pretending everything was fine. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Daniel, his laughter, their dreams, the promises they made when they had nothing. He also remembered the documents he had secretly changed. If he had not allowed greed to control him, both of them would have built the company together. Instead, one man became a billionaire. The other died believing he had been betrayed. 3 days later, Mr. George called an emergency meeting. His wife was there. His 2 children were there. His lawyers, his board members, even the company's senior management attended. Nobody knew why the meeting had been called. One of the directors smiled. "Sir, are we discussing the new investment?" Mr. George slowly stood up. "No, There will be no discussion about business today. The room became quiet. He looked at everyone before speaking again. For years, you have all called me a successful man. You have praised my hard work. You have celebrated my achievements. He paused. But today, I have come to tell you that the life you all admire was built on a lie. Everybody looked at one another. His wife frowned. What do you mean? Mr. George took a deep breath. Then, in front of everyone, he told the story from the beginning. How he and Daniel started with one old bus. How they struggled together. How success finally came. And how greed destroyed their friendship. When he finished speaking, nobody said a word. Some of the directors lowered their heads. His wife was in tears. His son couldn't believe what he had just heard. You mean this company was supposed to belong to both of you? Mr. George nodded slowly. Yes, I stole what wasn't mine. The room remained silent. After a while, one of the lawyers finally spoke. Sir, why are you telling us this now? Mr. George looked at him. Because I don't want to die as a respected man who lived a dishonest life. That same week, he instructed his legal team to begin searching for Daniel's daughter. The search lasted several weeks. Eventually, they found her. She was living in a small town in Ogun State. She was a secondary school teacher. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her was the same person her father used to call his brother. When Mr. George introduced himself, she welcomed him politely. She offered him a plastic chair and a cup of water. She didn't know why such a wealthy man had come to her humble home. Mr. George couldn't hold back his tears. I came because your father deserves justice. For hours, he told her everything. He didn't hide anything. He accepted full responsibility. When he finished, the young woman remained quiet. She looked at the old photographs he had brought. Then she looked at the man sitting before her. My grandmother always told me that one day the truth would come out. Mr. George nodded. She was right. He handed her a file. Inside were legal documents, transferring a large percentage of the company her father had helped to build. I cannot bring your father back. I cannot erase the pain I caused. But I can return what never truly belonged to me. The young woman began to cry, not because of the money, but because after 25 years her father's name had finally been cleared. A few months later, the news spread across the country. People were shocked that one of Nigeria's most respected billionaires had publicly admitted to a mistake that could have remained hidden forever. Some criticized him, some admired his courage. Others said he was foolish for giving away so much wealth. But Mr. George no longer cared about what people thought. For the first time in many years, he slept peacefully. He had finally learned that true wealth is not measured by the money in your account, but by the peace in your heart. Because no matter how carefully a secret is buried, the truth has a way of finding its way into the light.